friends, my name is Sarah. Welcome to Low-Sal-Life. If you're new here, this channel talks about food chemical intolerances, specifically salicylates, which are a natural aspirin compound found in natural foods that are supposed to be healthy for us. So it makes it a little bit challenging to eat a normal balanced diet. They're usually found in high concentrations in spices and a lot of healthy oils like avocado and coconut oil. They can also be found in most fruits and vegetables, and then in some other random foods, cosmetics, things that you put on your skin, things that we inhale, like there's lots of perfumes and chemicals, mothballs, cleaners that have salicylates. So it's a whole package. We have to think about more than just what we eat that can affect us. So if you're new here and you're interested in learning more, please subscribe and welcome to this journey. So today's video is going to be on a research article, and got it right here. It is Dietary Analysis in Symptomatic Patients with Celiac Disease on a Gluten-Free Diet, the role of trace amounts of gluten and non-gluten food intolerances. What I'm going to do is, this research article is, I don't believe it's available publicly online. Like, you can't just go to Pub Health and find it, the entire article. So I'm going to break it down in several steps. So we're going to learn about it. If you want to ever find the full journal article, I always recommend contacting the PI, the investigator, and asking them if they have a copy that you can get from them. They're usually able to and gladly will send that over to you, rather than paying on like the research subscription databases, right? The article itself was done in 1999, and so it's an old article, but it's not easily available for people. So that's the reason why I still think it's valuable to go over it. And this here is going to be covering information about patients that have celiac disease, but that doesn't mean that it can't pertain to us that have salicylate sensitivity. And this is mostly if you're gluten sensitive or have celiac, you want to hang around, because if you still have symptoms and you want to figure out what's going on, this might shed some light. Okay, so we're going to talk about, first of all, who did the study, and then that always gives us some insight as to why the study was done. We'll talk about who the participants were. We'll also talk about some gluten-free regulating agencies, and these covered in the article will specifically cover Australia, which is where the paper was done. And then just note that I'm only going to cover what the standards were in the research article. This study was done 21 years ago. So this paper is old enough to drink. So I just know that some of the celiac guidelines may have changed in 21 years, but the moral of this research study does not change. So that's just something to think about. And then we're going to talk about how the tests were set up, what the results were, and then there's always, in every research article, there's always a discussion and next steps, and basically it talks about you know, what was challenging about the study, you know, if they had a small sample of participants, like how it could have been done better, you know, to keep participants in the study, you know, stuff like that. What they wish they could have done, but they weren't able to. So those, that's always like discussion and next steps. And then also we'll talk about the limitations of the study. And I don't really have big concerns about this, but there are some concerns about this. So something to think about. And yeah, and then please leave any questions down in the comments that you might have that this study, that you think I may not have covered from the study, or maybe if you want more information on other studies similar to this. I do have on my research page on Low-Sal-Life, so I think it's lowsallife.com/research. I am breaking up any research articles I find on there by kind of by symptom. So I've got a gluten-free section, or a gluten-related section, and then like a digestion section. So just kind of keep an eye on in that. If I ever find any, or if you see something that should be there, please let me know. They'll go up on that page. The main investigator on this paper was Kim Faulkner-Hogg, and she is a registered dietitian that worked at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. That's what we call RPAH for short. And that's a good trivia question for people with salicylate sensitivity. It's like, what does RPAH actually stand for? They are in Sydney in Australia, and she worked in the allergy unit. I think later she got, I don't know if the allergy unit is part of the Department of Immunology, but she has also worked there as well. She also has co-PIs, which are Selby and Loblay. And so they work directly with patients, and this is the reason why they were interested in doing the study. What they were coming across was that they had patients that had diagnosed celiac disease. So they had confirmed biopsies of their intestines that showed damage to the villi. And after they had this diagnosis, then they went on a gluten-free diet. Now, generally the story is if you have celiac, the only thing that you have to do is live a gluten-free diet and you will be asymptomatic from your symptoms for the rest of your life. Now that sounds like a really great story, but people that are that have celiac or gluten sensitivity even if they have a really strict gluten-free diet, it's sometimes not enough. And so what this study was going to do was to show that, first of all, that there are differences between a gluten-free diet and a very strict gluten-free diet, and that there was a difference between that. And so putting people on just a normal gluten-free diet was not enough for some people to not have symptoms. The second thing that they wanted to address is that even if you're on a very strict gluten-free diet, you can still have symptoms, and a lot of times it was, you would blame that they weren't actually following a strict gluten-free diet, that they were actually having cross-contamination, or maybe they were cheating, or things like that, right? And so that's why they continued to have problems, right? That isn't what was happening. They were on a very strict gluten-free diet, and so this study wanted to show that they could potentially have symptoms from other foods. And some of the top blaming foods were soy, amines, salicylates, and millet. So those were the four main triggers. So two of those are proteins, right? The millet and soy. You can be sensitive to the protein probably, but the kind of like a true allergy. But the amines and the salicylates are actually chemicals. So those are harder to diagnose because they're in a lot of different foods, right? Like with amines, you can eat fresh chicken and be okay. And then you can eat like chicken broth or maybe a long, slow and roasted chicken, or even chicken sandwich, right? The longer that it's cooked, the more amines are going to build up in that. And then you could have a reaction to that. So, it makes it really challenging to figure out what these chemicals are, and that's the reason why this channel exists, so that we can become better educated. So let's talk about the agencies and who defined what as a gluten-free diet. So at the time of writing, you guys can do your research and find out what the modern day ones are. I know Celiac Foundation. So I was gluten-free for 12 years, so I know a lot about gluten-free diets. I got really close to figuring out what my problem was, but it wasn't gluten. It was actually folic acid in wheat products that was making me sick. And then of course I had the salicylate issue, which I figured out a year after the folic acid issue. So I know a lot about gluten sensitivity and about celiac and all the tests and everything. So I feel really comfortable to talk about this paper in particular. I've had my own criticisms of the Celiac Foundation because I've always thought that there might be a lurking variable, especially for people with gluten sensitivity or gluten intolerance, not specifically celiac, but because we don't know. We're describing things by symptoms. People eat certain foods and they get sick. So celiac, we can say it's the gliadin that makes people sick, and this is what happens. And we've been able to isolate that. So the Celiac Foundation has allowed certain products to have a Celiac Foundation stamp of approval on it. One of them that has always kind of bothered me is Kettle One vodka, which is actually a wheat product. And they basically say that because it's so distilled that it doesn't have any gluten in it. And that's probably true. But for people with gluten sensitivity, gluten intolerance that do not have a diagnosed wheat allergy, you kind of get wondering if you should be very, very strict and, eliminate all wheat products, wheat, barley, rye products, or if you should really hone in on there is no gluten in this, so I can't really get sick from it. So that kind of always has bothered me because we just don't know, and we define illness by symptoms. So that's an issue that I've always had with celiac. There is also another beer that I had up in Canada, but it was also a gluten-free beer made with barley, and I got sick from it. Hindsight, I now know that was salicylates, because beers are really high in salicylates. But it's like, am I really, is starting with a wheat or barley product, removing the gluten, enough? So that's kind of what the issue in 1999 was in Australia, and I'll read it to you because I don't have the best memory. So there was the Codex Alimentarius Commission of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, FAO, and the World Health Organization, WHO. The Codex Alimentarius allows the inclusion of up to 0.3% protein from gluten-containing foods and to be able to label it gluten-free. So they allow a low amount, it's almost negligible, right? 0.3% protein from gluten. So when they test it, as long as it falls under that level, it's considered gluten-free. And the foods that were most commonly, that fell under that was wheat starch or malts. So that one is considered we'll refer to it as the Codex GFD, Codex being the Codex Alimentarius. And so I'll probably refer to that as the gluten-free, and then I'll refer to the other one as strictly gluten-free. The second one is considered, they call it the no detectable gluten, a gluten-free diet, and so I'll call that the strictly gluten-free diet, so it'd be easier. It would not be considered gluten-free unless it was 0.001% gluten-free. So that means that it has hardly anything. And that's the limitation of the test. It might not even mean that there is anything in there. So that we'll call the strictly gluten-free diet. So we have the Codex gluten-free diet, which is 0.3%. And then we also have the strictly gluten-free diet, which is the no detectable gluten, 0.001%. So those are the two categories. And I'm sorry to bog us down with details, but you can't read research without looking at the details, because that's not very responsible. So now we're going to talk about who was in the study, because some of that is important, because each person is a person that improved on these diets or may not have improved. So they started with 50 volunteers, and 8 of them dropped out at the very beginning because they did not think that they could adhere to the strict elimination diet over the next few months from what they were proposing. So they were like, no, that's too strict, we're not going to do that. So they started with 42 participants. They eliminated pregnant and lactating women, people with the rash that is caused by gluten intolerance, the dermatitis herpetiformis, I think is how you say it. So they eliminated them. And anybody that had extreme medical conditions that they didn't think they'd be healthy enough to do the study. So they eliminated those. So we're still at 42 people. And then they had to have been diagnosed with celiac disease at least 6 months prior, had a biopsy that showed that they had damaged villi, confirming that they did have celiac disease, and then they had to improve in their symptoms with a gluten-free diet. Now, it didn't matter if they were on low or a strict gluten-free diet, they just had to have improvement. Of the people that were allowed to participate, they had to have bowel issues. So they specifically had to include diarrhea, urgency, bloating, abdominal pain, and flatulence. They could also have other symptoms like headaches, but those were the main symptoms they were looking at. They also had to have a second biopsy before going into the study to show that either from their first biopsy that they had improvement in the villi or that they still had damaged villi. So remember, biopsy 1, 6 months ago, 6 months of a gluten-free diet, depending on however we want to define it. And then second biopsy showing either that their villi has improved or has remained the same. So again, the theory that they're kind of disproving is that you can have a gluten-free diet and still be symptomatic and still have damaged villi at the end of 6 months. So that's what they're starting with. So they were split into two groups. One is, and I'll show you the picture. One is that the people that were on a strictly gluten-free diet, so that no detectable traces of gluten, and they still had symptoms, they would go on a very strict elimination diet, eliminating soy, millet, amines, salicylates, and I think it probably included other chemicals like, I think they mentioned glutamate and some other small chemicals that can bother people. And then on the other group, it would be people that were on the low gluten-free diet, right, the normal gluten-free diet. They would put them on a strictly gluten-free diet. And basically, as they improved, if they ended up with no symptoms, they would leave the study. From the picture here, their chart, people go from the Codex gluten-free diet to a strict gluten-free diet. They had 22 people. On the other side, there was the elimination diet. So these are people that were on a very strict gluten-free diet, was still having symptoms. They went on the elimination diet. And you can see that they started with N equals 31, that's 31 participants. After the elimination diet, there were 5 dropouts and 2 non-responders. And then they started going into challenges. So I'll talk about who got better on what. Of the 22 subjects that were on the Codex gluten-free diet, the entry biopsy specimen was normal in 7 of them and abnormal in 15 of them. All were instructed to eliminate those foods containing trace amounts of gluten from their diet, mostly focusing on the wheat starch-based bread mixes and malt-containing breakfast cereals. 5 of the 22 people reported a complete resolution of symptoms after the dietary change and left the study. So that's huge. 5 out of 22 people ended up going from a normal gluten-free diet to a strictly gluten-free diet, and 5 of them improved. So this shows that a gluten-free diet, as defined by Codex at the 0.3% remaining gluten protein, is not enough. In 3 other people, there was significant reduction in symptoms to the extent they did not consider it necessary to complete the study. So they also, another 3 people left just because they felt better and they were like, nah, I'm good enough. I'm not going to go through the rest of the elimination diet. So that's 8 out of the 22 improved, 36%. So that means that 8 out of 22 people improved from going from a gluten-free diet to a strictly gluten-free diet, 36% improved. A huge difference. This is why even those little tiny bits of trace amounts make a big difference for celiac. So we're now left with 14 subjects. Out of the 22, right, so 8 people got better. There were another 14 people who did not get better, switching over to a strictly gluten-free diet. So in those cases, they moved on to an elimination diet, and that included the amines, removing amines, salicylates, soy, millet, and we'll talk about them next. Okay, so what they ended up doing was, after that group, there were the 14 people from the strict gluten avoidance test that did not see improvement. So those 14 moved over to the remaining, there were another 17. So altogether they had 31 participants, and they worked through the elimination diet. So everybody at this point is now on a strictly gluten-free diet. They still have dietary issues. So 31 of these people moved on to the elimination diet. They had picked, because Faulkner and her team worked with patients, they knew that a lot of people, from anecdotal evidence, that a lot of people reacted to both soy and millet. So even though those seemed like really random foods to just pick, they were because they knew that a lot of patients with celiac had issues with that and were able to pinpoint that. So they eliminated the soy, the millet, amines, salicylates, and other chemicals that they've seen patients have issues with. So out of the 31 patients, 24 of them actually improved on the low chemical and no soy and millet diet. So on the elimination diet, 24 out of the 31 people improved their diets. 5 people thought that the elimination diet was too challenging and they actually dropped out. So out of the 24 people that improved on the elimination diet, they started working through challenges. So this is really common if you have food chemical intolerances, especially when you're testing what you have. You know, your doctor says take a food journal, right? So you want to go strict on what you're eating, and then you want to introduce one food, you know, maybe over the course of 2 or 3 days, and see if you have a symptom. What they ended up doing for the challenges is that they said that there were open challenges with milk, soy, and millet. I don't know if that means they could just make milk and, you know, pour a glass of milk and try it. But they also had opaque capsules, and the people couldn't see inside of them, and they would just take them. And I'll read off the list of foods that they tested in chemicals. Acetyl-salicylic acid, which is aspirin, phenylethylamine, and tyramine, which are amines, monosodium glutamate, sodium propionate, sodium nitrate, antioxidant, so that's something that really bothers a lot of people, is salicylate sensitivity. So BHA and BHT in particular, butylated hydroxyanisole and butylated hydroxytoluene. Preservatives like sodium benzoate, sorbate, metabisulfite, colorings like tartrazine and erythrocine, and also lactose. There are also placebos with potato starch and sucrose. And I think it's kind of interesting because people actually did react to the placebo, which is common. That's the reason you do a placebo. But you're talking about people that have GI issues. Like, we already know that people are sensitive to sugar, right? So that's sucrose. And then we also know that people can be sensitive, you know, with the whole gut microbiome. Like, your microbiome, the bacteria in there react to potato starch, right? It's like one of their like superfoods, right? So I think it's kind of funny that they picked those. I don't know what else they could have picked, but anyway, there were people that did react to the placebos, but that's not too weird to me. So what they did was, you know, they would take it and they would have the reaction if they did have one, and then they'd have to wait until they were healthy enough to take another one. And so I'll let you know what the results were. So out of the 24 participants, some of them knew that they were sensitive to lactose, and one of them just was like, I'm not touching lactose. I already know what that does to me. So it says here that 12 people reacted to the soy, 11 people reacted to the milk, 9 of the 22 challenged with millet, so not all 24 tested millet. 9 of the 22 people challenged with millet had a positive response. So we're going to look at the first chart, and this here shows number of positive challenges. So these are people with celiac, right? They know that they're celiac. They're like very defined as I have celiac disease. But here's the thing that's interesting. These are the number of positive challenges. So in no cases did they not also react to anything else, right? So at least, this is kind of a weird chart. So it says number of positive challenges. There were 19 people. You can see the N equals 19 on the side in the little caption. People either had 2 to 9 positive reactions to something. So there were 0 people that had 0 reactions to anything else. So they were only sensitive to gluten. And that's why the 0 and 1 are empty. So the first one, you can see number of people. There was 1 person that reacted to 2 other items. On the next one, you can see that there were 3 other people that reacted to 3 different ingredients. On the next bar, you have 5 people reacted to 4 ingredients. 1 person reacted to 5 ingredients, and so on. there were 2 people that reacted to 9 ingredients. So imagine, you go to your doctor and they're like, hey, you have celiac. All you have to do is avoid gluten. Little did they know that they should also keep looking and that they should also avoid 9 other ingredients. So something to think about. Okay, this is the second chart, and this is by symptom. 22% of them had diarrhea, 16% had headache, looks like about 14% had nausea, flatulence, cramping, pain, bloating, constipation, and then 16% of the people had other symptoms such as lethargy, urgency to vomit, and so on. Okay, and then this is the last chart, which is very helpful. Number of positive reactions to whole foods and chemical challenges. So here you can see that these were the soy, millet, and milk, like I said, they could just eat those, so they knew that they were consuming it. The rest of them were all a double blind with a placebo, so they did not know that they were consuming any of the other items. You can see number of subjects, 24 tested with soy, and half of them tested a reaction. With millet, 9 of them, 41%, had a reaction. With milk, 46%. And then 58 and 50% for amines and salicylates. And even still, the glutamates, propionic acid, the antioxidants, preservatives, colors, those were all in the 40 to 47% range. So quite a few that still reacted. Now that we've covered the results, we'll talk about the discussion. And since this video has been long enough, I won't go over the entire discussion that they talked about. But basically, I'll highlight a few items. The beginning of the discussion section of the research article talks about why they were kind of curious about it. There's a study, Fine et al., reported persistent diarrhea in 17% of patients with treated celiac disease, meaning that they were on a gluten-free diet. That study had 78 patients. In another study by the Celiac Society, 18% of 965 respondents reported the occurrence of GI symptoms at least daily after diagnosis, and at least 10% of the symptoms they considered severe. 90% were either following the Codex or the no detectable gluten-free diets. They did talk about if people, because remember they did biopsies at diagnosis and then prior to entry, at least a second biopsy. They did address that perhaps it's possible that patients without symptoms have had complete recovery of their mucosal lining, and they are now able to handle a little tiny bit of wheat starch or that malt, and so a normal gluten-free diet is fine for them. But if they still had damage, then a very strict gluten-free diet would be needed. And there's no research at the time to support whether or not that's true. We talked about how there's basically victim blaming about patients not adhering to a strict gluten-free diet. I think that this is really common where sometimes the medical community or the research community will assume that people did not adhere to the diet, or that they were just not educated enough to still make good, like there could possibly not be anything else that could be affecting your stomach. Like, we diagnosed you and you're obviously not following it well enough. So they talked a little bit about that. One thing that was interesting about this is this study, so they work with a lot of different people, right, in their food clinic. And if you start a salicylate-free diet, elimination diet, and you want to tell if it's salicylates or amines or glutamate or anything like that, you would be able to eat both soy and millet on those diets because they're low in chemicals. But they talked about how that might be the case for their normal patients. For celiac patients, they've noticed that they tend to react to both soy and millet, and so they decided to just remove those out of the custom elimination diet for them as well. So if you're still having issues on your low chemical diet, right, following this guide here, the elimination diet it mostly covers amines and salicylates. take out soy and millet. You might have better luck, especially if you have gluten issues. Let's talk about Sarah's concerns for limitations on this study. And I really only have two. The first was, of course, the placebo was done with sugar and potato starch. They seem kind of like plain, bland foods that shouldn't have a reaction, but I do think that there are generally people that react to sugar. So using sucrose was probably not the best placebo. And then, of course, potato starch, like I said. Especially now, since it's a superfood again. And I don't know, I'm kind of always wondering, I know potatoes are supposed to be low salicylates. I still react to them sometimes. So I'm a little hesitant to say that potato starch might not give some people a reaction. So anyway, so those are just the placebo things. But it's fine. It had like the normal amount of people that react to placebo, which is usually pretty low, but there's always somebody. The one thing that I didn't like from a salicylate perspective is that they actually did not test foods with salicylates. They actually tested aspirin. So what they were testing for salicylate sensitivity in foods was that they are sensitive to aspirin, acetyl-salicylic acid. One of the things that I think is really challenging from a salicylate perspective is that, yes, my doctor in the United States will say that I could potentially have a true aspirin allergy, which I think is also kind of weird because in order for you to have a true allergy, you have to be allergic to protein, and acetyl-salicylic acid does not have a protein in it. It is just a chemical, right? So I can't really have a true allergy, but they're willing to put that I'm allergic to aspirin in my chart. What they're not as willing to do is to say that I'm allergic to foods with aspirins in it. And it seems like it would make sense, right? And I can eat, an orange in front of them and start sneezing almost right away, but they're not really willing to say that salicylic or that a salicylate sensitivity exists. Right, so this study basically did not really say that these people are sensitive to foods with salicylates. They are saying that they were sensitive to acetyl-salicylic acid, which to me is kind of a fine thread, but it's an important one to notice. So, however, if these people went home and they started eating foods that did not have salicylates and they did not have, obviously they didn't have symptoms, the elimination diet was true enough because they had eliminated foods with salicylates and they saw an improvement. So, there was a two-part system there. The challenge of testing with acetyl-salicylic acid was really helpful because the people that reacted to the acetyl-salicylic acid, the aspirin, would be more diligent when they're reintroducing foods to avoid the foods with salicylates and still have no relapse of symptoms, right? And then the other people that did not react to the aspirin, could probably introduce salicylate foods without having any issues, right? Going fearlessly to reintroduce those foods. So I think that even though my concern that they challenged with aspirin is important, I think that the elimination diet, since it was done well enough and those people had relief from their symptoms, I think that really is covered there. Well, I think I killed the hell out of this this research article. It's very challenging because this paper is, I don't know, 8 pages long, 10 pages long, and you really shouldn't just read headlines or even the abstract for a research paper to understand it. So it is really important to dive into it, and I think that the people that are interested in this article probably did stick around for the end. I'm guessing that you're probably people with gluten sensitivity or celiac sensitivity that's interested in getting better. So I hope that this video was helpful for you. Please leave a comment down below if you've heard of this study or have never heard of it or appreciated my explanation of it. Again, there are ways to get your hands on this paper. And I'm fortunate enough to work at a university where I get basically free access to almost all research articles, so I'm happy to break them apart for you and talk to you about them over YouTube. If you're interested in more content like this, please give it a thumbs up. It lets me know that you're interested in this and lets YouTube know that other people are too. With that, I think I'm all done. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at low-sal-life, and I will see you next week. Thanks. Bye.